Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Now, we hear a lot about how the policies and decisions of previous generations have put the future of the youth today in danger. And there is weight in that argument. I mean, decades of unconcern for the environment have ushered in a climate emergency. Apathetic political moves leading to conflict have left more than 35 million people under the age of 18 displaced around the world. In light of International Youth Day, on today's episode, we discuss what the future looks like for young people. One of the key aspects we will be focusing on is education. Now, the United Nations wants this year's theme to highlight efforts to make this education more inclusive and accessible for all youth. We take a closer look at what's happening. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Calvin Robinson, who's a teacher and head of research at Parliament Street, joining us from London. We're also joined by Dr. Rayshawn Ray, who's an associate professor of sociology and the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Sciences Research at the University of Maryland, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, Dr. Ray, let me begin with you. In light of International Youth Day, the United Nations wants to highlight the theme of more accessible and inclusive education. Now, following from that and looking at the political climate around us today, the socio-economic climate around us today, what do you think are the main hindrances preventing people from accessing education?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the show. When I think about access to education, particularly inclusive and equitable education, ethnic plurality isn't necessarily the issue. So in other words, people in education have gotten comfortable with seeing diversity visually. However, people haven't necessarily gotten as comfortable with structural changes that actually lead to not only individuals being accepted into universities, which is also a barrier, but even after they get there, actually dealing with the fact that they might experience more discrimination, more unjust treatment, more marginalization in those particular spaces. And I can say that my colleague and I, Dr. Audra Buck-Coleman, we've actually done a study where we followed students from their freshman to senior year, looking at their experiences in college. And I can tell you that one of the biggest things we found is that the political climate in the United States and around the world are affecting native-born students, are affecting international students, are affecting their relationships with each other, are affecting how they think about their future job prospects, and is really shaping the ways in which they think about what society is going to mean moving forward.
Right, and you mentioned here a list of factors and how they change and they impact the students. And I want to talk about that in greater depth. But before that, I'm going to jump to Mr. Robinson and talk to him about the same point. Now, something very interesting that Dr. Ray mentioned here was access to equitable education. Now, what does equity mean in this case? Explain to our viewers.
I think that's a very interesting point because in the English education system in particular, we've been looking at this a lot lately and thinking about, okay, so this child is from this background or this child has this disadvantage in life. So what can we do differently to help them through the education system? And I think in all honesty, we've gone too far in the opposite direction in that we've got to a point where we're now making excuses and we're in result lowering standards and lowering expectations. And if we want to raise aspirations for all young people, we need to higher our standards and our aspirations and have high expectations for all children, no matter where they're from, no matter what their background or their disadvantage, and kind of pull them all up that ladder at the same time.
Right, but here when we're talking about standards, what steps are there? I mean, we talk about standardized testing, and we know that there are certain measures that are taken, and studies have come out that they disadvantage people from certain backgrounds. So what standard are we aspiring towards? One that only is befitting for a certain group, or one that is created considering all groups?
See, I don't think there's certain standards for certain groups. I think we can have high expectations for all individuals, no matter where they're from. And that conversation there is the problem, I think, in that when I talk about standards, I'm talking about a teacher in a classroom at the front passing on their knowledge and their experience to a room full of students. And that doesn't necessarily need to be in a different manner depending on your ethnic minority status or your social status or anything like that. And that's where we've gone wrong, in that we've tried to have special circumstances, and it's actually narrowing and singling people out where they don't need to be.
Right. Mr. Robinson, that's an important point you make, but I do want Dr. Ray take on it as well. Now, throughout my education, and I'm sure this is the case for all my viewers as well, you do see privilege as playing a major role. I mean, it allows you access to understand certain kind of literature, even language. It plays into the entire educational process there. Now, Dr. Ray, trying to make sense of what Mr. Robinson said, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when I think about what it means to be equitable and some kind of the assumption that standards are being lowered, instead I see something different. Instead, in the United States, what we just witnessed over the past several months was a firestorm of individuals who people would consider to be extremely privileged, particularly as it relates to income and wealth, who were actually paying for their children to end up at top universities. That's not something that poor people were experiencing. That's not something primarily that racial and ethnic minorities were experiencing. That was something that was acute among people who were privileged, who are using their wealth and income to actually get something that some other people couldn't necessarily access. And they were actually cheating at it at some of the top universities, not only in the United States, but around the world. I think the other thing I know, teaching thousands of students at some of the major universities in the United States, from obviously University of Maryland, but working with students at University of California, Berkeley, University of Michigan, University of Memphis, Indiana University. One thing I know is that students come, particularly from low-income backgrounds. And one thing I can tell you at the undergrad level, as well as getting master's and graduate and PhDs, if those students are in those programs, it's typically because they definitely deserve to be there, because they typically haven't had the same resources. They typically haven't had the same access to other types of resources, such as studying for standardized tests, which we know are already culturally biased. It's not necessarily like those tests are objective. So we have to be very clear about how we frame what it means to lower standards, because it leads to this assumption, at least in the United States, that all of a sudden affirmative action, for example, means that you're giving people some kind of leg up, or you're giving them something that they didn't deserve. Right. And instead, what I've seen, on the other hand, is that students definitely deserve those. And if they had the same resources as other students, they would definitely succeed.
Right. Now, you both have given perspectives on this matter. I'd like to take the discussion forward and talk a little more about how the education system, how it's influencing the youth, and especially when we're talking about these future leaders. How are the political dynamics in the world, as Dr. Ray, you mentioned earlier as well, how are they impacting the youth?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned previously, as we think about the political climate and how it's impacting youth today, Dr. Audra Buck Coleman and I did this study, and essentially what we found is that the political climate is stymieing students' abilities to learn. And what I mean by that is they're so focused on what's happening politically, whether that be dealing with racial discrimination, hate crimes, but also dealing with other factors such as recessions and economic downturns, as they think about which majors they want to major in. I mean, you have students making different decisions, going into majors that they didn't necessarily want to because they're worried about their future job prospects. And one thing we know over the past, say, 15 years is that young adults at the beginning of the recession, say a decade ago, they were actually more independent. They were more likely to be attending higher education. They were more likely to be living alone. They were more likely to be paying their own bills. These are things that we've seen that we consider to be progress. But if you ask those students whether or not they're going to do better or worse than their parents, a lot of them are saying worse. And that has to do with politics. That has to do with the economy. And it's completely shaping this millennial generation and Generation Z.
Right. Mr. Robinson, going from the points that were made here, but also talking about the curriculum, we have heard a lot of activists around the world saying that the curriculum is not upgraded to the crises that the world faces today, whether it be in climate change or the politics that is occurring at this point in time, which is unique. What do you have to say about that? Do you think that there is enough focus on that aspect of education?
I do worry about that. There've been a lot of conversations lately about things like, should we replace Mozart with rap artists on the curriculum and make it more relevant for the youth of today? I think that's where we come again to lowering standards. We've got to teach the best there has been, and we should teach that to all. And that's raising cultural literacy. And I think that's what Dr. Ray was touching on, that these people from disadvantaged backgrounds might not know Shakespeare or Mozart. And we've got to encourage that. We've got to pass that knowledge on to them so they can survive in those more privileged arenas. And I think when we're talking about politics in school, what worries me the most in the US and in the UK in particular is this left-wing indoctrination in that most educators are of a left-wing stance. I think there was 80 to 90% of all teachers would vote for a left-wing party. And if these are the people teaching our children, there's no diversity in their opinions and in the biases, that worries me dramatically.
Right. Mr. Robinson, picking up something you mentioned here, that they should be able to survive in the privileged system that they are going to be placed in the future. Now, at the risk of sounding too idealistic, isn't that a failure in the education system in itself? If it is continuously reproducing a system which allows certain people to succeed more than others?
Right. So we have to fill that gap by giving them the knowledge they need, that cultural literacy, that cultural capital. They need to experience theatre and the arts. They need to know about the greatest music composers there have been.
So they can participate and they can be in the same rat race. I'm talking about a more radical transformation here.
Okay, in what way would that be? Would that be doing away with all of this stuff that we consider great, the classics, etc., just to make it more accessible? Because I don't think that's the right way. I think we need to make everyone aware of these, and that's how we encourage people to be inclusive, rather than taking things away.
All right. Dr. Ray, do you also agree with that, those thoughts?
No, not exclusively. I don't agree with those, and I'll contextualize it a bit. First thing is, it doesn't have to be an or. It can be an and. So the assumption that some kind of way that Mozart, simply because it's classical, is better than other genres of music, say like rap, for example, when, just as an example, you have Kendrick Lamar, who has actually won international awards for his poetry. You have Tupac's lyrics being taught at major universities around the world. I don't necessarily think it has to be an or. It could be an and. And I think that's part of the problem on the other side, is that people like to do an or. And people like to frame things as if the history and the way things have always been has been correct, when in fact, there would be a lot more people doing classical music if people weren't necessarily excluded historically. I want to make one point about this. Toni Morrison recently passed away.
Right.
International poet, author. And I read a story about how a student who was a great student, African-American student, who was adopted by a white family in the United States, had went to great schools, got to college, was a great student, and was taking a literature course. And he had never read a book by an African-American scholar before. Went to college and had never read a book by an African-American scholar. He read one of Toni Morrison's books, and he started crying in class. And he said, I never knew that Black people could write like this. See, that's part of the problem when we've always used what was before instead of aiming to integrate and incorporate what's going on. There are tons of great writers, tons of great literature people around the world. And when you look at the makeup of people who are viewed as artists, people who are viewed as authors, people who are viewed as classics, you see an underrepresentation. That underrepresentation isn't because people are underperforming. That underrepresentation is because people are excluded. And being in higher education, one thing I know is the assumption is made that these are these liberal bastions of glory, and that's not simply the case. There are a lot of people across the political spectrum, conservative or otherwise. The problem is that oftentimes conservatism now has been linked to the alt-right, which is then linked to white supremacy. So you have people who are detaching from that. And if conservatives actually want to address some of these fundamental issues and deal with this, then they need to separate themselves from some of the alt-right ideology that exists in their political parties.
Right. Dr. Ray, you make points there. But moving on with this discussion, Mr. Robinson, I want to touch upon more, and you as a teacher will be able to enlighten us better regarding this, the importance of empathy. And I'm not just talking about students in higher education, but in primary schooling as well. How much of a role should that play, and how would you say that that should be inculcated in the classroom so that the problems we see today, whether it being the migration crisis, whether it being racism, the rise of the right wing, all these problems that we see today, they can perhaps be curbed in the future?
That's a good question. I think a lot of this lack of empathy is something we need to focus on, because there's an emphasis on looking after the self and this pursuit of happiness, for example, is quite a selfish pursuit. I think we need to be looking more at community service and serving others rather than serving ourselves. And that is character building. That is something that we as teachers can encourage young people to look after each other and to look after people in their wider community, whether it's the school or where they live or where they go to work. So that is something we need to be doing more of. I think touching on briefly what Dr. Ray said about the curriculum side of things. Yes, it isn't always an and/or situation. We can have multiple things, but the curriculum is finite. So whatever we add to the curriculum, we take something away. So we always have to consider that. So if we're adding a new subject or a new area, we've got to think, what are we taking away? What are the students going to lose out on if we introduce this?
Right, but how do we make these informed decisions? Like you're saying that the curriculum is finite, you need to make smart choices. Now, considering the crises we are in today, and I will continuously mention them because those are the conversations that young people are having. Climate change, migration, they're talking about socialism now, there is more interest in it. Now, how do we shift the curriculum in a way that it informs this generation that's curious about all of these things, that sees all of these as future potential dangers and is better informed about them?
Well, I think climate change is already a large part of our national curriculum in England. It's already on our geography and PSHE subjects, so it is taught. But the problem is not that it's taught, it's that how young people perceive it and how the media is perceiving it at the moment, in that these Greta Thunberg's Friday strikes, for example, encouraging young people to take a day out of school is atrocious. They're missing out on important learning, important knowledge in a whole range of subjects to make a political point. And while that point is important, and it is great that young people are becoming more politically active, we shouldn't take away from their education to do that. Talk about it on a Saturday or Sunday, write about it, do a protest, do a petition. There are other ways of communicating the need to raise the debate about climate change as a specific example. And I think we should be encouraging all our young people to be in school as much as possible.
But I think the point that they try to make here, and I'm not speaking on behalf of them, but from what I can interpret, is that take this seriously enough because we are putting our education on the sidelines to make this point. I mean, it's about a sustainable future. If there is no earth, if there is no clean air, then the education, where will you use it?
So is it about that, or is it about bunking a day off school because a load of your friends are doing it? I don't know. I can't speak for the young people that are taking time out. But what I can say is that we are teaching about climate change. Our country is doing a lot more than most countries in order to help the global situation. If these young people really care, they shouldn't be ditching their plastic bottles on the streets while they're out protesting. And they should be focusing on countries like China that are actually damaging the world a lot more than we are.
Well, if we talk about the European Union, it is a fact that the subsidies on fossil fuels are still the same. I mean, while you're saying that the country is doing enough, there is still a lot of backlash that they're still not doing enough given how much time they've had for progression. But on that point that you raise regarding political activism, that is an interesting point, and that's something that I'm going to take to Dr. Ray before we end this segment here is political activism and children and young people becoming more into it, becoming more inclined towards it. Why do you think they are going towards it in a rapid force? What do you think is driving them towards it?
Yeah, I think what's driving young people toward political activism is the simple fact that we are in the middle of a global social movement. We're in a movement for, in the United States and around the world, a movement for Black lives. We're in a movement for climate change, and not just climate change, but people understanding and realizing that it's real and the ways that people contribute to it. We are in the middle of a global economic downturn. Youth are going to bear the brunt of some of these political trade wars that's going on between different countries around the world. And so I think part of what's happened is it's a very important fundamental point. Youth around the world have grown up today thinking that the world was going to be a better place. Their parents told them that. Their teachers told them that. That's what they thought the world was going to be. And over the past 5 to 10 years or so, that hasn't been their reality. So as they are coming up in this particular era, and part of this we have to think about, people who are even say in their late 20s, but definitely in their 30s and 40s. I'm currently teaching college students, for example, who definitely weren't alive when some of the large wars in the Middle East that involved the Americas and Europe were going on. And they definitely weren't around when 9/11 happened in the United States. So many of them weren't even born then. So all of a sudden you grow up in the United States in particular with an African-American identifying president, and then you get a new president who completely goes against some of the ideals that you thought was going on, and you feel like they have been lied to. And when people feel like they've been lied to, they tend to take things into their own hands, which typically means protesting, which is their fundamental right to do. We should never tell people they shouldn't do those type of things, but instead we should aim to understand what they want, dealing with gun violence and other sort of issues or things they're concerned about, and we should really be paying attention and listening.
Right. On that point, unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment, but thank you so much, Dr. Rashawn Ray, for joining us from Washington, D.C., and thank you so much, Mr. Calvin Robinson, for joining us from London. Both of your points were very strong and very valuable to this discussion. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to discuss this further. Stay with us.